Hey guys, tonight we trudge across the endless dunes, where the wind hums like a forgotten lullaby and sand stretches in every direction, so uniform it almost hypnotizes you. You probably won't survive this, not because of predators or heat, but because boredom and silence here are sharper than any blade. Your only companions are the sun, the sand, and a handful of monks who move like shadows across the barren landscape. They barely speak, rarely laugh, and somehow manage to find profound meaning in staring at the same stretch of sand day after day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Somewhere, maybe it's the dead of night, and somewhere else, you're trapped in your office pretending to work. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow a thin trail of footprints in the sand, the only evidence that life persists here. The desert monks you meet have dedicated themselves to a life so quiet it almost hurts to hear. Their robes are simple, flowing like the mirage of an oasis on the horizon. They walk barefoot, feeling every grain beneath their feet, as if the sand itself is a teacher. Every step is deliberate, every pause is intentional. Most of the time, they do not speak. When they do, it is in whispers barely above the wind's sigh. And even then, only to convey necessity, water, fire, or meal. You realize that your own voice, so accustomed to interruption, laughter, or casual conversation, would feel invasive here. Like a clap of thunder in a library, their days begin with the sun, not a clock. Morning light spills across the dunes, and you follow them to their small encampments of mud brick and stone, barely distinguishable from the desert itself. Some scholars still debate whether these structures were primarily defensive against raiders or spiritual, meant to isolate monks from the temptations of the wider world. You trudge past a low wall and see the remnants of a small cistern, water glinting faintly, a precious lifeline in this vast emptiness. And yet, life exists. Small animals scurry between dunes, and insects crawl over sparse vegetation. The monks notice these subtle movements, sometimes documenting them in tiny sketches, or simply reflecting in silence. One quirky habit you can't help but notice is their tendency to mark the same footprints repeatedly. A meditative ritual that seems meaningless to outsiders, but carries layers of spiritual significance. You try to mimic it and immediately trip over your own feet. Lesson learned. Meals are sparse and ritualized. Dates, barley, dried figs, sometimes goat milk. Simple fare that fills the body, but leaves the mind hungry for contemplation. You nibble awkwardly on a fig and realize that your urban palate will never appreciate this kind of sustenance. They chew slowly, letting each bite register not just on the tongue, but in thought, almost as if digestion is both physical and spiritual. Historians still argue whether these dietary restrictions were strictly religious or evolved as a practical necessity in such harsh conditions. Either way, watching them eat is hypnotic. You find yourself chewing more slowly, as if by osmosis. Time itself feels different. Hours stretch lazily, punctuated only by subtle rituals. The movement of the sun, the placement of shadows, the ritual sweeping of sand around the encampment. You notice a fringe detail. Some monks occasionally whisper to the wind, claiming it carries messages to distant monasteries. Whether this is true or a quaint superstition is unknown, but in the quiet, it seems perfectly plausible. As the first section of your journey concludes, you realize the desert isn't just a landscape. It's a teacher, a mirror, and a confounding puzzle. The monks embody patience, silence, and a devotion to observation so intense it almost hurts to witness. You trudge a little further, letting the sand shift beneath your feet, preparing for another day in the quiet lives that have persisted along the silk routes for centuries. You trudge further into the desert, letting the sun bake the sand beneath your feet. Each step sinks slightly, as though the earth itself is reminding you that nothing here is stable, nothing is hurried. The desert monks move alongside you, their sandals, or often bare feet, leaving shallow impressions that the wind will erase in minutes. You realize quickly that monotony isn't optional here. It's the fabric of life. They rise, walk, pray, eat, and rest according to patterns dictated not by clocks, but by sun, wind, and memory. The desert stretches endlessly, and you begin to understand why silence is not just preferred, but enforced. Their days revolve around routines so meticulous they almost resemble choreography. They rise at dawn, stretch their bodies, and orient themselves toward the mountains or distant dunes. Then, they tend small flocks or cultivate tiny patches of desert-tolerant crops near hidden oases. You trudge beside a monk tending a few goats, noticing the precision of his movements, each step measured, each action deliberate. It's almost mesmerizing. Even watering a single plant becomes an exercise in mindfulness. You splash water on the root of a stubborn desert shrub and realize that a splash too far or too little could mean life or death for this tiny oasis. Historians still argue whether the order of daily chores was purely practical or deeply spiritual, but here the line blurs. The monotony is broken only by fleeting natural events. A hawk glides overhead, the shadow crossing the sand like a moving meditation. Tiny desert flowers poke through the grit, surviving against improbable odds. You learn quickly that the monks watch and interpret these small signs as messages from the world around them. One quirky habit you notice: monks often trace patterns in the sand during rest periods, drawing concentric circles or simple geometric shapes. They call this a conversation with the desert, a ritualistic exercise in patience. You try it and end up drawing a shape that looks suspiciously like a lopsided star, your first failed attempt at desert meditation. Meals are few and deliberate. Barley porridge, dates, dried figs, and goat milk constitute the standard fare, often consumed in silence. Every chew is slow, every swallow deliberate, a reminder of the body's fragility in the harsh environment. You take a bite of a date and notice how the sweetness seems to anchor you in the present moment. They fast on certain days, consuming only water, and the rhythm of hunger and satisfaction is woven into their meditative practices. You try to fast alongside them for an hour and quickly realize you are dramatically unprepared, probably one of the few things. You're allowed to fail at here without serious scolding. They also carry out small manual tasks to keep the monastery functioning. Stones are shifted to reinforce walls, sand swept from entrances, small irrigation channels dug or cleared. Each action is done with quiet efficiency, often as a form of meditation in itself. The repetition of these tasks is hypnotic, and you find your mind wandering in patterns that mimic the rhythm of work. Sweep, place, dig, water. Historians still debate whether these labor rituals were primarily spiritual exercises or simply necessary to maintain survival in such extreme environments, but watching them, the distinction feels almost irrelevant. The desert's harshness shapes every detail of life. Even rest is a careful exercise. Monks sleep lightly, listening to the whispering of the wind, attuned to subtle shifts in temperature or sand movement. Any sudden sound could indicate danger, from a predator to a band of passing traders. And yet, despite the harshness, there is a surprising playfulness hidden in small habits, like tracing their fingers over grains of sand to form letters or symbols, or whispering to the wind and claiming it carries messages to distant monasteries. You try whispering a message yourself, feeling a small thrill of ridiculous hope that the wind might actually listen. By the time you trudge to a small dune overlooking the monastery, the sun begins its slow descent. Shadows stretch long across the desert floor, and the monks gather for evening reflection. You realize that this life, so quiet and repetitive, cultivates a sensitivity to subtlety you've never experienced. Each sound, each movement, each grain of sand carries significance. The desert is not empty, it is alive with lessons. And as you settle near the edge of the dunes, you feel the rhythm of the monks' quiet lives imprinting itself upon your own hurried, noisy mind. You approach the monastery, its walls barely distinguishable from the dunes around it, a muted sand color blending almost seamlessly into the horizon. The structure is simple yet purposeful. Low mud brick towers, narrow windows for ventilation, and thick walls that shield against both sun and sandstorms. Each building seems to have been designed not for grandeur, but for survival and contemplation, the kind of architecture that whispers rather than shouts. You trace the edges with your fingers, noticing how the bricks are imperfect, hand-shaped, yet perfectly arranged, a reminder that utility and patience often coexist with subtle artistry. Historians still argue whether these monasteries were built primarily for defensive reasons against raiders, or purely as spiritual retreats. And as you step inside, it's clear that both needs shaped every beam and doorway. Inside, the coolness is immediate, a stark contrast to the desert heat outside. The air smells faintly of dried herbs, goat hair, and the lingering scent of smoke from simple oil lamps. You walk past narrow corridors where light filters through latticed openings, creating patterns on the dusty floor. Each room serves multiple purposes: sleeping, studying, prayer, and storage. You notice small niches in the walls where manuscripts and scrolls are kept, each carefully protected from sand and sun. The monks move through these spaces with the precision of someone who knows every inch by heart. The central courtyard is open to the sky, a square of compacted sand surrounded by low walls. Here, monks gather for work, meditation, or exercise. You see a monk sweeping a path with slow, deliberate movements, as if each stroke of the broom is a silent prayer. Another tends to a tiny patch of hardy herbs, tracing irrigation channels with a stick, ensuring every drop of water reaches its intended route. You can't help but notice a quirky detail. Some monks plant seeds in geometric patterns, claiming that the act of arranging nature is itself a meditation. You try to mimic a small triangle of herbs, only to misalign the lines hopelessly, earning a small, amused glance from a passing monk who clearly considers your attempt innocent but futile. The prayer hall is modest, but deeply evocative. A small alcove marks the direction of the nearest holy site, and the walls are lined with simple frescoes or inscriptions that tell the history of the monastic order. You step inside quietly, feeling the smooth stone underfoot, the faint echo of every footstep magnified in the sparse chamber. A monk kneels in silent devotion, lips moving imperceptibly, and you realize that prayer here is more than ritual. It is a practice intertwined with the rhythm of the monastery itself. Scholars still debate whether these spaces were primarily spiritual, or if they functioned also as silent classrooms for preserving knowledge and discipline. Beyond the main buildings, you notice defensive features, low ramparts, narrow slits for observation, and subtle inclines that slow intruders. Some argue that these measures were necessary to protect the monks and their manuscripts from wandering bandits and thieves along the silk routes. You can see why. While the monastery feels serene and meditative, its placement and construction betray a constant awareness of danger. Water management is another marvel. Cisterns are hidden within walls. Channels carved into the sand direct runoff from rare rains, and simple stone spouts feed small basins. A fringe detail that surprises you. Monks occasionally chant softly over the water, claiming the vibrations purify it. Whether this works physically is debatable, but the practice adds a ritualistic dimension to survival. You lean down and touch the cool water, marveling that in a place so dry, this little network of ingenuity sustains life daily. Everywhere you look, the monastery embodies restraint, purpose, and quiet ingenuity. Simple furniture, plain bedding, and minimal personal items reinforce a culture where distraction is carefully minimized. You notice small personal touches, an etched design on a wooden chair, a painted motif on a door, that hint at individuality within strict communal discipline. Even in isolation, creativity finds a way. As you settle on the courtyard floor, watching monks tend, pray, and sweep, you feel the rhythm of life here, deliberate, unhurried, and entirely attuned to the desert. The monastery isn't just shelter, it's a living system, a carefully maintained universe where survival, spirituality, and scholarship coexist. And as the sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the walls, you begin to sense that every brick, every channel, every small cultivated patch of earth carries centuries of wisdom quietly preserved in the sand. Dawn breaks over the dunes like liquid gold spilling across the sand, and you awaken to the faint creak of wooden shutters and the soft sigh of wind through the monastery's narrow corridors. The monks rise with the sun, not with alarm clocks, not with schedules written in ink, but with the instinct of centuries of repetition. You trudge beside them to the prayer hall, each step sinking slightly into the sand-packed courtyard, the grains crunching softly beneath your feet. Their movements are deliberate, precise, a choreography honed over years. Even your own clumsy steps seem loud in comparison, but the monks pay you little mind, absorbed as they are in their own ritual. The hall is a quiet sanctuary, cool despite the growing heat outside. You notice the faint scent of sandalwood from tiny oil lamps, curling around columns and casting flickering shadows on the simple stone floor. One monk kneels at a small alcove, his lips barely moving as he chants a morning prayer. The rhythm is steady, hypnotic, a soft pulse in the silence. You try to follow, your voice awkwardly loud against their whisper-like cadence. realizing quickly that prayer here is as much about internal focus as it is external expression. Historians still argue whether these chants were primarily devotional or intended to sharpen the mind for hours of contemplative work, but you can feel their dual purpose in the stillness of the room. After prayer, the monks move to meditative reflection. They sit cross-legged, eyes closed, hands folded, and occasionally trace symbols in the sand in front of them. Some draw simple circles, others more intricate geometric patterns meant to mirror cosmic order. You try copying a small circle and end up smudging the sand messily. A silent glance from a nearby monk tells you, practice, patience, presence. These meditative exercises are punctuated by subtle breathing techniques and slow, intentional gestures, creating a rhythm that harmonizes the body, mind, and environment. Breakfast is minimal but deliberate. You watch as a monk pours water into a small bowl of barley porridge, adding a crushed date or two. Each bite is slow, each swallow purposeful. There's a quirky custom. Monks tap the bowl 3 times on the ground before eating, claiming it honors the unseen spirits of the desert who watch over their sustenance. You tap your bowl hesitantly and almost laugh when nothing visible happens, though the ritual somehow makes the meal feel more significant. The monotony of ingredients, dates, barley, goat milk, gains richness through mindfulness, turning scarcity into meditation. Once fed, the monks engage in work that seems mundane, yet is deeply structured. Some sweep courtyards, others tend small gardens, while a few begin copying scrolls in dimly lit rooms. Each action is rhythmic, almost musical in its repetition. You notice a fringe detail. During copying, some monks hum softly, claiming the vibrations preserve the ink and ward off mistakes. Whether it works physically or psychologically is unclear, but it emphasizes the importance of attentiveness in every gesture. Outside, the desert is waking with you. Shadows shorten, and the heat begins to intensify. The monks remain mindful of the sun's path, adjusting tasks and positioning to avoid exhaustion. Their clothing, simple and flowing, shields them from both sun and wind, and their movements conserve energy, revealing the practical wisdom embedded in ritual. Even walking is considered a meditative act, each step measured, each inhalation deliberate, a dialogue with the arid environment. You trail a monk toward a small garden, where irrigation channels carefully direct rare water to the roots of hardy plants. Observing him, you notice that his actions are precise yet fluid, a subtle dance of necessity and devotion. He traces water channels with a finger, ensuring no drop is wasted, and gestures toward a patch of wheat while whispering a few words, perhaps a blessing, perhaps a reminder of cosmic order. Historians still debate whether these morning rituals were primarily spiritual, practical, or a combination of both, but the result is a life deeply attuned to both body and landscape. By mid-morning, the monastery hums with quiet energy. Chants fade into concentrated silence. Footsteps are soft and purposeful, and even the air seems to carry a steady rhythm. You realize that the dawn rituals are not merely ceremonial. They are a blueprint for living deliberately, an instruction in patience, observation, and harmony. Each monk participates in a synchronized ballet of prayer, movement, and reflection, their lives unfolding like a slow, mesmerizing narrative written across the sand, walls, and sky above. By mid-morning, the monks retreat to their modest kitchens, a quiet, sun-drenched space tucked beneath low arches. The smell of barley porridge mingles with faint traces of dried herbs, and you watch as a monk carefully measures handfuls of grain, pouring them into a worn clay pot. Meals are minimal: dates, dried figs, goat milk, occasionally a bit of flatbread. It seems impossibly plain compared to the variety you're used to, yet the monks treat each ingredient with deliberate attention, turning preparation into an exercise in mindfulness. You nibble a date hesitantly, marveling at how sweet and sustaining it is in such a sparse diet. Fasting is an integral part of their practice. Certain days are reserved for total abstinence from food, and even water may be limited during the hottest hours. You follow along for a short stretch, and quickly notice the physical and mental challenge it presents. Hunger sharpens your senses, slows your movements, and yet paradoxically brings a strange clarity. One quirky ritual involves the monks tracing faint symbols on the sand while fasting, murmuring inaudible words, claiming it focuses the mind on spiritual sustenance rather than the body's craving. You try a crude version and almost smudge your own fingers into the sand, eliciting an amused, patient glance from a nearby monk. Despite the austere diet, the monks maintain surprising energy. You trudge with one who leads a small flock across a sandy plateau, his steps steady and precise. The heat is relentless, but he barely sweats, moving with a rhythm that seems internalized, a bodily practice of both endurance and meditation. You attempt to keep up and discover that even walking slowly in this heat requires strategy. Step in shadow when possible, pause deliberately, and let each movement conserve energy. Historians still argue whether this endurance training was intentional spiritual discipline or merely adaptation to the environment, but from your exhausted vantage, it feels like both. Meal preparation itself is meditative. You watch as one monk grinds barley into coarse flour with a small stone. The rhythmic motion, hypnotic. The sound, stone against stone, grain scattering into a pile, is oddly calming, like a desert percussion track. Another monk heats goat milk over a small brazier, carefully skimming the surface, murmuring a quiet chant that may be blessing, ritual, or mental focus. Food is nourishment in body and mind, a subtle balancing of practicality and contemplation. Interestingly, the monks have unusual ways of avoiding monotony. While their diet remains basic, some invent playful methods of serving, arranging dates into small geometric patterns or slicing figs to resemble tiny suns. These small acts of creativity, though purely aesthetic, transform the act of eating into a ritualized engagement with the environment. You attempt a sun-like fig, only to have it collapse in your hand, an embarrassing but enlightening reminder that simplicity often requires as much care as complexity. Fasting and minimalism extend into their social interactions as well. Meals are usually eaten in near silence, conversations reduced to practical instructions or gentle acknowledgements. The silence is not oppressive, it is intentional, designed to cultivate awareness and appreciation for the present moment. Fringe accounts suggest that some monks occasionally taste their food with their eyes or fingers before eating, claiming that the mind can anticipate nourishment and that anticipation is a form of spiritual practice. You can't decide whether to try it, but the idea lingers humorously in the back of your mind. The monk's diet and fasting schedule also intersect with health practices. Simple herbs from their oasis gardens are used as medicine. A sprig of thyme for digestion, a poultice of clay for minor wounds. You follow a monk tending to a small herb patch, learning which leaves are edible, which medicinal, and which are purely symbolic offerings. Historians still debate whether these gardens were practical survival tools, spiritual experiments, or a blend of both. But watching the careful hand of each monk, the purpose seems simultaneously functional and sacred. By late morning, the heat climbs higher, prompting a quiet retreat to shaded nooks, where monks drink sparingly and meditate or review texts. You sit in a small alcove nibbling a date, watching the rhythm of water dripping into a shallow basin, and begin to understand how scarcity and ritual interweave into a life that is at once simple and extraordinarily disciplined. Even the act of eating, the most basic necessity, becomes a lens through which patience, mindfulness, and harmony are cultivated. After the sparse breakfast, the monks gather in a small, dimly lit room filled with scrolls, inkpots, and bundles of parchment. You step carefully among narrow benches, the faint smell of dried ink and aged paper filling your nose. This is where knowledge is preserved, copied, and sometimes created anew, a silent workshop of the mind in the midst of the desert. Each monk handles the materials with painstaking care, smoothing parchment, carefully grinding ink, and tracing letters with precision that borders on obsessive. One quirky habit catches your eye. Some monks chew the tips of their brushes lightly before writing, claiming it steadies the hand, though the idea seems more superstition than necessity. Historians still argue whether these manuscript practices were purely religious devotion, practical preservation of texts, or a combination of both. But the rhythm of the work feels sacred regardless. You sit beside a monk copying a text, watching the steady movement of his hand. Every curve and line is deliberate, each pause meaningful. The faint scratching of quills against parchment creates a hypnotic rhythm, nearly blending with the soft murmur of wind outside. You attempt a few strokes yourself and quickly see why patience is valued here. One small error can mar the page, and mistakes are neither easily erased nor forgiven. The monk's meticulousness preserves more than words. It safeguards centuries of knowledge that might otherwise vanish in the desert's harsh embrace. Some scrolls are historical, chronicling the trade along the Silk routes. You notice the detailed maps, hand-drawn caravan paths, and annotations noting local customs, dangers, and oasis locations. These texts aren't merely practical. They contain spiritual reflections, meditative commentaries, and curious marginalia. One text even contains small doodles of animals wearing tiny hats, added by a monk with a sense of humor, a reminder that levity finds its place even in solemn work. You can't help but smile, realizing that the desert encourages both discipline and subtle playfulness. The copying process is often accompanied by soft recitation. Monks whisper lines as they write, their voices barely audible above the scratch of quill. This practice is said to reinforce memory and ensure accuracy, though some claim the vibrations themselves bless the parchment. You trace your fingers lightly over the dry surface of a sheet, imagining the hands that came before, the breaths taken, the focus maintained over endless hours. The monotony might appear tedious, but it serves a higher purpose: continuity, preservation, and mindfulness. Beyond the daily copying, monks sometimes create new texts, philosophical reflections, theological musings, or poetic explorations. You watch a monk pausing frequently, gazing out a small lattice window, letting the desert inspire thought. The silence around him sharpens reflection, turning the empty space into a canvas for ideas. Scholars still debate whether these works had wider influence along the Silk routes or were purely inward-facing exercises. But observing the process, the importance of contemplation is undeniable. Even in isolation, the monks remain subtly engaged with the outside world. Traders pass along news, items, or stories, which the monks note in margins or adopt into new texts. One quirk: some monks embed small codes in their writings, playful puzzles or symbolic language that only those trained in the monastery could decipher. It's an intellectual game disguised as devotion, a quiet bridge between rigorous discipline and human curiosity. As the morning stretches, you realize the act of copying is more than work. It is meditation, exercise, and conversation with generations past and future. Each carefully traced letter is a thread connecting the desert to the broader world. Even the faintest whisper of quill against parchment resonates like a heartbeat through the monastery, reminding you that in this quiet, extreme life, knowledge is not just preserved, it is lived. By midday, the desert heat intensifies, and you trudge along a narrow path leading away from the monastery toward the Silk route itself. From here, the monks occasionally encounter travelers, merchants laden with silk and spices, wandering scholars, or occasional diplomats seeking guidance. You follow silently, keeping pace with one monk who moves like a shadow, his robe brushing the sand. His eyes flick constantly, noting footprints, distant mirages, and even the faintest change in wind direction. These encounters are rare but significant, offering glimpses into the broader world without disturbing the sanctuary of their isolation. Historians still argue whether monks actively sought to influence travelers or merely observed silently, but the desert teaches them that both presence and absence carry weight. A caravan approaches, a line of camels, their humps swaying rhythmically, merchants calling softly to each other in foreign tongues. You notice the monk step slightly aside, allowing the caravan to pass, yet maintaining a subtle awareness of every movement. One quirky custom emerges here. Some monks offer travelers a single date or a sip of water, then retreat silently without uttering a word. This minimal gesture serves as both hospitality and discipline, teaching gratitude without fostering attachment. You accept a small date, realizing that in this context, even the simplest acts carry ritualistic significance. The conversations with passing scholars are similarly subdued. Travelers often share news, tales of distant lands, or minor philosophical debates. The monks listen quietly, taking notes in their margins or memorizing small details. Some whispers are so subtle that you have to lean closer to hear them. These exchanges are not casual. Each syllable is weighed for utility, spiritual significance, or potential insight. The monk's silence paradoxically amplifies the importance of every word spoken, creating a layered communication that balances listening with observation. You trail a monk as he leads a scholar to a hidden oasis. The journey is quiet, each step measured, as though the desert itself demands decorum. Small signs, like the angle of a sand ripple or the presence of a lone cactus, guide them, and you realize that the monk's knowledge of terrain is encyclopedic. Fringe accounts suggest some monks could navigate the desert blindfolded, relying entirely on memory and intuition. You try following their path with eyes open and still find yourself struggling to keep pace. Occasionally, a debate arises. One merchant questions the monk's silence, suggesting that more speech could foster better trade or knowledge exchange. A monk responds only with a subtle nod, perhaps signaling agreement or gentle correction. These interactions are layered, often misunderstood by outsiders, but perfectly coherent to the monks. Historians still debate how much these desert dwellers influenced Silk Route commerce, but every gesture, every subtle cue seems deliberate, as if they are quietly shaping outcomes without ever needing to speak plainly. You watch a scholar unpack a small bundle of goods, dyed silk, rare spices, a few scrolls. The monk inspects items, noting quality and origin with subtle gestures. A raised finger here, a tilt of the head there. The ritualized manner of trade reflects a philosophy of minimalism and attentiveness. Every act matters. Every observation counts. You feel the weight of centuries of practice embedded in these interactions, a knowledge both tangible and invisible, preserved silently in habit and gesture. Even brief encounters carry lessons. The monk's patience, careful listening, and deliberate hospitality teach you more than any formal instruction. Every traveler is a test of observation and restraint, a chance to maintain equilibrium while engaging with the wider world. The desert itself seems to hum approval, the wind brushing across dunes as if to punctuate each silent exchange. By the time the caravan disappears into a distant haze, you notice the monastery in the distance, a quiet bastion of order and reflection, and realize that these fleeting interactions are threads connecting isolated life to the vast tapestry of the Silk Route. The sun climbs higher, and the heat shimmers across the sand, creating wavering illusions of water and distant walls. You trudge slowly behind a monk who pauses, squinting toward a wavering mirage. The desert is merciless, yet it fosters extraordinary perception. Monks claim that long exposure heightens senses and opens the mind to subtle spiritual experiences, visions, intuitive insights, or fleeting whispers of the unseen. Fringe accounts suggest some have reported seeing distant caravans hours before they arrive, or glimpsing spiritual entities moving across the dunes. You try squinting into a heat haze and mostly see sand, but it's enough to understand why mysticism is deeply intertwined with desert life. Historians still debate whether these experiences are psychological phenomena or genuine mystical encounters, and you feel your skepticism gently waver under the desert sun. They stop at a quiet spot where the dunes form a natural amphitheater. The monk kneels and traces a circle in the sand, muttering faint words. You notice that he does this regularly, aligning the circle with the sun, wind, and distant mountains. The ritual is precise yet fluid, a combination of devotion and attentiveness to nature's rhythms. You mimic the circle hesitantly, and the monk smiles subtly, approval tempered by patience. There's a playful, almost human side to these otherwise austere practices, a reminder that even in extreme isolation, curiosity and humility coexist. Meditation here is different from anything you've experienced. The desert is not silent. It hums with the sound of shifting sands, distant cacti rattling, and faint echoes of life hidden in the dunes. The monks sit cross-legged, eyes closed, tuning into these subtleties. Breath becomes a tool. Inhalation and exhalation syncing with the subtle pulse of the desert itself. You try to follow along, but your breaths feel intrusive, too loud, too irregular. The monk's quiet mastery emphasizes that even presence is a practice, and that observation can be more profound than action. During breaks, some monks engage in visionary exercises. One practices mirage mapping, recording patterns of heat waves and desert illusions in small sketches, claiming that these observations reveal truths about both nature and mind. You trace his diagrams, fascinated by the way natural phenomena are interpreted as guides for spiritual reflection. One quirky detail: some monks whisper to the wind during these exercises, believing it carries fragments of insight to other monasteries miles away. You hum lightly and pretend to send a message, feeling a silly thrill of imagined communication across the desert. Mysticism also manifests in dreams. Monks document nighttime visions in journals, noting celestial alignments, recurring symbols, or intuitive insights gained during sleep. Scholars still debate whether these practices were genuinely predictive, psychological training, or elaborate storytelling. You notice a notebook filled with small sketches of stars, sand dunes, and strange, almost abstract shapes. Each mark feels alive, capturing the desert's subtle rhythms and the monk's inner reflections. The heat eventually drives you back towards shade, but the experience lingers. Sitting beneath a narrow arch of the monastery, you realize that desert isolation cultivates an extraordinary sensitivity. Every ripple of wind, every shimmer of heat, every whisper of a distant creature is observed, interpreted, and internalized. Even the smallest events carry meaning. Mysticism here is less about overt miracles and more about perception, patience, and deep engagement with an environment that is simultaneously hostile, beautiful, and endlessly instructive. By late afternoon, you trudge slowly toward the monastery, letting the lessons of observation and quiet reflection settle into your mind. The desert hums in the background, a low, continuous meditation that resonates with every step. You feel subtly altered, more alert, more present, yet paradoxically calm. The mirages may have been illusions, the whispers may have been wind, but the effect is undeniable. The desert has taught patience, attentiveness, and a strange, almost mystical appreciation for subtlety. By mid-afternoon, the monks retreat to their small oasis gardens, pockets of life carefully cultivated amid endless sand. You follow a narrow path, each step sinking slightly into the fine grains, until the first hint of greenery appears, a stubborn patch of wheat, a few sprigs of thyme, and a cluster of hardy desert flowers. These gardens are tiny miracles, fed by subtle channels carved into the earth, guiding scarce water to every root. You bend down, letting the sun warm your shoulders, and marvel at the ingenuity required to coax life from such an inhospitable environment. Historians still debate whether these gardens were primarily practical, ensuring survival, or symbolic, representing spiritual cultivation in miniature. Watching the monks, it becomes clear that they are both. One monk kneels to tend a small irrigation channel, adjusting its path with painstaking precision. You notice the quirk. He hums softly as he works, claiming the vibrations encourage growth. You hum along, half in solidarity, half in amusement, feeling the strange satisfaction of participating in the garden's rhythm. Each plant is nurtured deliberately, leaves trimmed, soil smoothed, water applied drop by drop. Even tiny details matter here, teaching patience and the careful observation of cause and effect. Some monks grow medicinal herbs, sage, thyme, and small desert-adapted plants used for poultices or teas. You trail a monk as he gathers a small bundle, inhaling the sharp, aromatic scent of dried leaves. These plants are not merely practical, they are part of a larger system connecting the monastery to the desert's natural cycles. Fringe accounts suggest some monks whisper intentions into the soil before planting, believing that mindfulness accelerates growth. You try it with a clump of thyme, muttering a silent hope for resilience, and the monk glances your way, offering a tiny nod that acknowledges your earnest effort. Beyond sustenance and medicine, the gardens serve as spaces for quiet reflection. Monks sit among the greenery, tracing patterns in the soil or counting leaves, a form of meditative exercise that blends observation with spiritual practice. You notice how even small sounds, water dripping from a channel, wind rustling leaves, are magnified in this microcosm, creating a living symphony of detail. It becomes obvious that the gardens are not only practical, but also a training ground for mindfulness, teaching attentiveness to subtle cues and small, otherwise overlooked life forms. Another quirky feature: some monks arrange plants in geometric patterns, symbolizing harmony with the cosmos. You attempt a small triangle of desert flowers and immediately realize how difficult it is to balance precision with nature's irregularities. The monk beside you simply smiles, gesturing that intention matters more than perfection. This gentle lesson mirrors the broader desert philosophy: control the controllable, observe the rest, and find meaning in small, deliberate acts. The oasis gardens also foster subtle social connection. Monks work in pairs or small groups, communicating through gestures, nods, and shared rhythms rather than words. Even silence is structured, a form of tacit coordination that strengthens community bonds. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional method of spiritual training or merely a byproduct of environmental necessity, but the effectiveness is apparent. The gardens thrive, the community functions, and the quiet discipline cultivates resilience. As the sun tilts lower, casting long shadows across the sandy courtyard, you linger among the plants, feeling the interplay of life, water, and ritual. Each leaf, each ripple of water, each whispered intention is part of a delicate ecosystem, both natural and human-made. You realize that survival in the desert is inseparable from attentiveness, patience, and respect for the smallest details, and that even in the harshest landscapes, life persists, nurtured by deliberate care and mindful presence. The late afternoon sun begins to slant across the dunes, casting long, soft shadows that stretch like slow fingers over the sand. You trudge beside a monk toward a small cluster of caves used for solitary reflection and study. Each cave is modest, a low stone entrance, a simple mat for sitting, and a narrow ledge holding a few scrolls or herbs. The air inside is cool, a welcome reprieve from the heat outside, and the walls hum faintly with the memory of centuries of quiet devotion. Fringe accounts suggest some caves were used for visionary exercises, where monks would spend days in near isolation, attuning to the desert's rhythms and listening for subtle cosmic signals. Historians still debate whether these retreats were primarily spiritual, practical, or a blend of both, but as you step inside, the purpose feels self-evident. You follow a monk as he settles cross-legged on his mat. The stillness is immediate, almost tangible. Breath becomes a measured rhythm. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The monotony of the desert outside seeps in, magnifying subtle sounds, the distant rustle of sand, the faint cry of a desert bird, the whisper of wind through small crevices. You attempt to match his calm, but your thoughts buzz like distracted insects. Patience, he seems to say without words, is cultivated slowly, over countless repetitions. Monks practice visualization here. One closes his eyes and traces the path of a caravan across the silk routes, imagining the traders, the animals, the sway of goods, and the heat of the desert sun. You follow along, imagining tiny camel hooves pressing into sand, a merchant pausing to sip water, the faint shimmer of a distant oasis. The exercise is meant to sharpen memory, attention, and empathy for distant lives. You notice a quirky detail. Some monks sketch the imagined journeys in the sand before closing their eyes, as if the act of drawing cements the vision more firmly in the mind. Cave study often incorporates texts as well. You watch a monk unroll a scroll, tracing letters carefully, his lips moving in almost imperceptible whispers. Each line is absorbed with deep concentration, connecting the mind to both the physical act of writing and the conceptual world of the text. Historians still debate whether the primary goal was preservation, meditation, or intellectual engagement, but the result is clear. Knowledge is integrated into the very fabric of daily existence. During these solitary periods, some monks perform subtle body movements, slow stretches, hand gestures, or patterned steps across the floor. These exercises are intended to maintain physical health while also reinforcing focus. One fringe practice involves tracing geometric shapes with the toes or fingertips in the sand, believed to align the practitioner with cosmic order. You attempt a small circle with your fingertip and smudge it immediately, earning a quiet, indulgent glance from the monk nearby. Even solitude is social in its own way. The monks leave small offerings in each cave, a sprig of herb, a tiny water dish, or a carefully folded scroll. These are not merely practical. They maintain a thread of continuity between those currently in retreat and those who will follow. You leave a small pebble in one niche, feeling absurdly proud of this minimal contribution, and the monk simply nods, a silent acknowledgement of shared presence across time. By the time you leave the caves, the desert is deepening into a softer gold, the shadows stretching and blending into one another. You trudge back toward the monastery, carrying a subtle sense of expansion, your mind quieter, your senses sharper, and your awareness gently tuned to the rhythms of wind, light, and human ritual. The caves have not just offered solitude, they have imparted patience, observation, and a sense of connectedness to the larger pattern of desert life. As the sun dips lower toward the horizon, you find yourself following the monks to a small plateau overlooking the dunes. The desert glows with molten amber, the wind carrying faint grains of sand that dance like sparks across the landscape. From this vantage, the Silk Route seems both distant and intimately present. Faint tracks, occasional camels in the far distance, and the subtle signs of traders long past. Monks pause here daily, not merely to rest, but to observe the desert's intricate patterns, attuning their minds to movement, rhythm, and change. Historians still debate whether these lookout practices were defensive, spiritual, or a blend, but the plateau undeniably offers a meditative perspective on the vast environment. You watch as one monk kneels, tracing circles in the sand with a stick, aligning them with the setting sun and distant mountains. This ritual is both practical and symbolic, a meditation on time, direction, and cosmic order. You try to imitate his careful gestures, only to smear your lines, eliciting a faint, indulgent smile. The practice seems simple, almost childlike, but the precision required hints at centuries of refinement. The plateau is also a teaching space. Younger monks learn to read subtle cues in the desert, the angle of sand ripples, the flight of birds, or the texture of distant dunes, all indicators of weather, water sources, or approaching travelers. You bend closer, trying to identify patterns in the sand, realizing that this desert is a living book, written not in words but in motion, shadow, and temperature. Fringe accounts suggest that some monks could detect water sources hidden beneath dunes, purely by reading the subtle color and density changes in sand, an almost supernatural skill born from patient observation. Evening. Rituals are often performed here. The monks face the setting sun, chanting in soft, near inaudible tones, their voices blending with the wind's murmur. You try to follow along, and your words sound harsh, too loud, like a city intruding on the desert's quiet. One quirky detail catches your attention. Some monks occasionally toss a handful of sand into the air during chants, believing it carries their intentions skyward. You mimic the gesture, laughing softly as grains scatter and glitter in the dying sunlight. Meals at this time are modest and taken in silence, usually consisting of barley bread or small dates. The monk's restraint emphasizes awareness. Each bite is deliberate, each swallow measured. You attempt to eat with similar mindfulness, quickly realizing that you've underestimated the discipline required. Yet there is a quiet joy in simplicity, an appreciation for sustenance that is not rushed or taken for granted. Historians still argue whether this practice was a spiritual teaching or a practical adaptation to scarcity, but its effect is unmistakable. Conversations at dusk are minimal, conveyed through gestures, glances, or shared movement. The silence is purposeful, designed to deepen awareness and reduce attachment to unnecessary words. You notice how even subtle communication carries weight. A tilt of the head, the pace of a step, the position of a hand. These are the language of the desert, learned slowly and intuitively. As twilight deepens, you trudge back toward the monastery, watching shadows lengthen and the wind begin to cool the sand. The plateau's lessons linger: patience, observation, and a profound sensitivity to subtle patterns. The desert is more than a landscape. It is a teacher guiding you through silence, repetition, and attentive presence. You realize that even brief exposure to these rituals changes the way you move, breathe, and perceive the environment, planting seeds of mindfulness that may endure long after you leave the dunes. Night falls gradually, draping the desert in a deep, inky blue. You trudge behind a monk toward the monastery's small observatory, a simple platform built atop a low sand mound, its walls just high enough to shield from wind, yet open to the sky. The stars are astonishing here, millions of pinpricks blazing in crisp clarity, far from city lights or smoke. You tilt your head back, and it feels as if the cosmos has been lowered for inspection. The monks gather silently, each one settling into their own space, eyes fixed on constellations. Historians still argue whether these celestial observations were primarily spiritual exercises, navigational tools, or an intertwined blend of both. One monk gestures toward Orion, tracing the hunter's outline with his finger, then shifting to nearby stars used for navigation. You follow his movements, noting how he aligns points in the sky with distant landmarks. The desert here becomes a three-dimensional map, and the night sky is both classroom and scripture. Fringe reports mention that monks could estimate hours of the night, or even approaching weather patterns, by subtle shifts in starlight, an intimate knowledge of patterns that seems almost supernatural. You try tracking a cluster of stars, squinting and blinking, realizing how much practice under these conditions has shaped centuries of observation. Soft rituals accompany the night sky. Some monks hum or whisper brief chants, claiming the vibrations attune the mind and spirit to the universe. Others trace shapes in sand, connecting imagined lines between stars above and patterns below. A cosmic meditation made tangible. You attempt to replicate a simple triangle, smudging the lines immediately, and the monk beside you nods gently, as if approving your effort, but emphasizing patience over perfection. There's humor and humanity hidden in this austere setting. Tiny reminders that even the most disciplined lives have room for gentle mistakes. The monks also record observations in tiny notebooks, jotting symbols, brief phrases, or sketches that capture the essence of the night. Some entries detail meteor showers, others note subtle color shifts in planets, while a few contain personal reflections or philosophical musings inspired by the stars. You flip through one carefully, feeling the centuries of accumulated knowledge and thought. It's a fusion of practical astronomy, spiritual contemplation, and playful curiosity, an almost holistic approach to understanding the universe. As the night deepens, a subtle chill settles over the desert. The monks wrap themselves in simple cloths, but the cold is more than physical. It is an opportunity for reflection, a natural pause in the rhythm of daily labor. They remain attentive, listening to the faintest sounds, shifting sand, distant owl calls, the whisper of wind over the dunes. Every subtle signal is part of their education, a lesson in mindfulness and attunement. Historians still debate the full purpose of these nocturnal practices, whether preparation for meditation, navigation, or preservation of observational traditions. But it is clear that their effects are profound. You lean back against a low wall, letting the desert absorb you. The interplay of light and shadow, the infinite scatter of stars, and the soft presence of monks around you create an almost sacred quiet. Time feels suspended, measured not in minutes or hours, but in breaths, heartbeats, and subtle shifts in wind and starlight. One monk murmurs a soft reminder that the night teaches humility, patience, and perspective, and you feel the weight of centuries condensed into a single, serene moment. By the time you rise to return, the desert is hushed, and your mind is filled with constellations, patterns, and small intentional movements. Even the simplest gestures, tracing a line, noting a star, whispering a phrase, seem imbued with significance. You trudge back through the cold sand, realizing that these nocturnal rituals are not merely observation. They are a deliberate training of perception, attention, and wonder. Skills honed slowly, silently, and with immense care. The night deepens, and a gentle wind rises, carrying faint whispers across the dunes. You follow the monks to a small communal hall, where a flickering oil lamp casts soft, wavering light across the walls. The air is warm from the day, but tempered by the cooling desert, and the faint scent of incense drifts through the space. This is the hour for reflection and storytelling, though not in the loud, dramatic sense you might expect. The tales are quiet, intimate, shared in murmurs or simple gestures, a practice designed to preserve both memory and mindfulness. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were primarily educational, spiritual, or social, but the effect is unmistakable. They cultivate deep awareness and subtle connection. You settle on a worn mat, watching a monk slowly unroll a scroll. His hands move deliberately, every gesture precise. The story begins softly, a recounting of a caravan's journey along the Silk routes, its perils, triumphs, and mundane details rendered with painstaking care. Even small moments, like a merchant misplacing a single pouch of spices or a camel pausing to graze, are noted with quiet reverence. Fringe accounts suggest that monks sometimes embellish these details, adding symbolic meaning or allegorical lessons that blend practicality with philosophy. You listen, imagining the desert stretching endlessly, the caravan's dust trail shimmering in the sun, and the faint, rhythmic chant of distant wind. As the story unfolds, lessons are embedded subtly. One monk gestures to the floor, indicating lines drawn in the sand that mimic trade routes. Another traces a small diagram, illustrating the interconnectedness of merchants, oases, and monasteries. You notice the meticulous care taken to align narrative with physical reality, maps, gestures, and visual cues reinforcing the spoken word. The monks treat the act of storytelling as both preservation and meditation, transforming history into a living, breathing practice. The communal storytelling is also interactive in a quiet, disciplined way. Listeners are expected to observe, reflect, and, when appropriate, add subtle commentary. One young monk traces small circles in sand beside the storyteller, indicating patterns of behavior or highlighting moral lessons. You attempt to follow, drawing a shaky circle that collapses immediately, earning a gentle, almost amused glance from a senior monk. Even mistakes are absorbed into the learning, reinforcing patience and humility. Quirky traditions appear as well. Some stories are punctuated with the tossing of a handful of sand, marking key moments or symbolizing a passage of time. You mimic the gesture, laughing softly at the grainy cascade, feeling a strange sense of connection to centuries of ritualized narrative. These tiny, playful acts coexist seamlessly with solemn reflection, highlighting the monk's ability to blend discipline with subtle human delight. By the end of the hour, the story winds down, leaving an impression that extends beyond mere words. The monks sit quietly, eyes lowered, letting the narrative settle. You feel a similar quietness within yourself, a soft attunement to rhythm, detail, and the subtle interweaving of lives and landscapes. Even in silence, the story continues, echoing in your mind as you trace patterns of dunes, caravans, and celestial bodies, realizing that knowledge, memory, and mindfulness are inseparably linked in this desert world. The desert night deepens, and a low, almost imperceptible hush blankets the monastery. You follow a monk toward the small meditation courtyard, a rectangular space enclosed by low walls and dotted with shallow basins of water that reflect the starlight. The ground is smooth, swept meticulously each evening, and the air carries the faint scent of sage and crushed herbs. Here, the monks engage in walking meditation, a practice that blends physical movement with deep attentiveness. Each step is deliberate, a tiny ritual echoing centuries of disciplined rhythm. Fringe accounts claim that some monks could measure time almost perfectly by counting their steps across the courtyard, an exercise in patience, balance, and awareness. Historians still debate whether these walks were primarily spiritual, physical, or a combination of both, but watching them, you feel the cumulative effect of centuries of refinement. You follow a monk's lead, attempting to match the measured pace, heel, toe, pause. The motion is hypnotic, the soft scrape of sand underfoot blending with the distant hum of wind. There is no rush, no goal, only the meticulous awareness of movement. A single misplaced step feels jarring, and you suddenly understand why the monks place such emphasis on discipline and mindfulness. Even the act of walking becomes a lesson in attentiveness, presence, and bodily memory. The courtyard also serves as a space for reflection on the day's lessons. Monks pause at certain markers, small stones, shallow depressions, or etched lines, to contemplate events, observations, or insights. You stop at one marker, feeling the weight of stillness, letting the events of the day settle in your mind. The desert's vastness, the hum of the wind, the distant glimmer of dunes all converge in this simple, contained space. A quirky habit among some monks involves lightly touching the stones with fingertips while inhaling slowly, a gesture believed to transfer awareness from body to mind. You try it, the touch grounding you in the present moment more effectively than you anticipated. Evening reflections are intertwined with celestial observation. Monks occasionally glance upward, noting constellations, moon phases, or the passage of a bright star, integrating cosmic awareness into the meditative walk. The desert itself seems alive with information. Shifting sands, distant mirages, subtle temperature changes, all woven into the practice of observation. You notice how the rhythm of footsteps, patterns of shadow, and celestial markers align in a silent, elegant choreography that has been refined over generations. Historians still argue about the degree to which these practices influenced spiritual insight versus practical survival. But the synchronicity of movement and awareness is undeniable. At certain moments, monks stop completely, standing in perfect stillness, eyes closed, letting the desert and night sky communicate in silence. You attempt the same, feeling the subtle breeze against your face, hearing distant sounds of shifting sand and nocturnal life. It is humbling, an exercise in surrendering urgency, control, and distraction, and learning to inhabit a present that is both vast and intimate. As the night reaches its zenith, you sense a subtle transformation. Movements feel lighter, attention sharper, and the desert less imposing, more instructive. The courtyard becomes a space where discipline, reflection, and subtle joy converge, teaching lessons that extend beyond physical steps or ritualized gestures. You realize that even a single night's walk, performed with mindfulness, can reshape perception, instill calm, and nurture a sense of profound connection to place and purpose. The desert night is fully settled now, a deep indigo stretching in all directions, pierced by an endless scattering of stars. You follow a monk toward the monastery's quiet library, a small domed structure whose walls are lined with scrolls and notebooks that have survived centuries of wind, sand, and sparse rainfall. The air is cool and faintly scented with old parchment and a hint of incense. Here, the monks engage in contemplative reading, absorbing knowledge in silence, letting words and ideas permeate slowly, like water seeping through sand. Fringe accounts claim some monks could read entire scrolls by candlelight in a single night without losing comprehension, a feat that seems part skill, part legend. Historians still debate the extent to which such intensive study shaped broader knowledge exchange along the Silk routes. You settle on a low mat, unrolling a small scroll carefully. The text is intricate, combining practical guidance for desert survival, observations of trade, and reflections on spiritual discipline. Each line is both utilitarian and meditative, demanding attention and care. You trace the letters with your finger, feeling the subtle texture of dried ink, the weight of the monk's hand that wrote centuries ago. There is a subtle pleasure in connecting to past minds through this silent medium, a bridge across time maintained by care and ritual. Some monks annotate margins with tiny symbols, stars, circles, and small pictograms that mark points of emphasis, reflection, or memory cues. One quirky practice is to draw these symbols while whispering softly to themselves, as if sound enhances the ink's permanence. You imitate it quietly, noting the odd satisfaction in combining voice, gesture, and observation. Even small acts become layered in meaning, reinforcing the principle that mindfulness permeates every aspect of desert life. As the night deepens, the monks occasionally pause to discuss observations, but never loudly. Conversations are whispers, nods, or subtle gestures, focusing on refining understanding rather than debating endlessly. You find yourself caught between awe and amusement at the level of discipline. Every sound, movement, or breath is imbued with intentionality. Historians still argue whether these subtle interactions were purely internalized training, spiritual communication, or a coded method of preserving collective wisdom. You notice a young monk struggling with a scroll, frowning slightly. An older monk approaches, lightly touching his shoulder and gesturing toward the text. Without a word, a subtle lesson is imparted. Patience over force, observation over instruction. This quiet mentorship pervades desert life, showing that guidance can be profoundly effective even without explicit speech. The young monk nods and continues, his posture slowly relaxing, absorbing not just the words but the environment, the rhythm, and the centuries of discipline embedded in the monastery. Eventually, the monks roll up scrolls, extinguish small oil lamps, and settle into sleeping mats. The desert outside hums softly with wind, shifting sand, and distant creatures moving under moonlight. You lie down alongside them, aware of the layers of history, observation, and mindfulness that saturate the monastery. Every creaking mat, every faint whisper of wind, and every subtle shift of starlight contributes to a profound sense of continuity and calm. You close your eyes and let the desert, the silence, and the centuries of quiet discipline guide your thoughts into stillness. Patterns of dunes, ancient trade routes, and tiny symbolic annotations float across your mind's eye. You feel connected, grounded, and strangely elated by the subtle joys and profound patience embedded in this extreme, silent life. The desert teaches that wisdom, observation, and calm are cultivated slowly, deliberately, and with attentive love. The night settles fully around you, soft and endless, and the desert exhales a gentle, rhythmic hum. Your body relaxes into the warmth of the mat, each grain of sand beneath you a reminder of how small, yet connected, you are to this vast landscape. Thoughts drift slowly, like clouds over distant dunes, unhurried and expansive. You remember the careful walks in the courtyard, the quiet observation of stars, the measured movements of the monks tending their tiny gardens, and the subtle gestures that spoke volumes without a single word. Each memory is a thread, weaving a tapestry of patience, attentiveness, and gentle discipline. The air is cooler now, carrying the faint scent of sage and dry earth, mingling with the soft rhythm of wind over sand. You feel the desert's vastness pressing softly against your consciousness, not to overwhelm, but to lull, to teach surrender and presence. Even the smallest sound, the whisper of your own breath, a distant rustle, the soft shift of sand beneath unseen creatures, seems amplified yet comforting. The monastery fades into this quiet, becoming less a structure and more a living extension of the desert itself, shaped by centuries of mindful presence. Your thoughts grow softer, stretching into the empty spaces between them. Every action of the day, the meticulous tracing of patterns in sand, the careful tending of herbs, the whispering of texts, the observing of stars, is distilled into a calm awareness. You understand, without effort, that the monks' lives are about noticing the subtle, appreciating the ordinary, and finding depth in silence. Even the desert wind becomes a gentle companion, guiding you towards stillness. As you drift, the desert's lessons merge with your breathing, slow, deliberate, unhurried. The vast night sky, the distant dunes, the centuries of quiet study, all blend into a single rhythm. You feel connected to something larger than yourself, an ancient, gentle pattern of observation, patience, and presence. And finally, as your eyelids grow heavier, you let go completely, carried into sleep by the soft, persistent hum of the desert.